Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for watching this. Yeah, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you a little bit today about philosophy of color and the Routledge Handbook on Philosophy of Color that's scheduled to be released in June 2020. And a special thank you to David Briggs and the Colour Society of Australia. David has written a wonderful chapter on color spaces for this volume, and it was his idea to put together this event today. And he was kind enough to ask me if I would like to contribute. I'm more than happy to do so. And my name is Derek, as it says there. I'm at the University of Glasgow, housed in the Center for the Study of Perceptual Experience and also the Department of Philosophy. My outline for today is as follows. First, I'll give a quick overview of philosophy of color as it's conceived in the Routledge Handbook. And then I'll switch to a talk on general issues in the ontology of color, or the nature of what color is and where we might find color in our world. So the first part of that will be talking about views according to which colors are objective, why we should at least consider rejecting those views, what sorts of options of more subjective-based color might be available to us, and then very briefly comment on which of these one might prefer before concluding. Now, to be sure, my aim is not to tell you what colors are. My aim is more to lay out what some of the groundwork options are that are prevalent in philosophy of color right now, and to kind of push and prod in various directions to hopefully get you to a place where you're a little bit uncomfortable and unsure as to how to address the question. That is, I'm going to try to be a philosopher. Okay, philosophy of color, a quick map. The impetus for this event, as you know, is the forthcoming Routledge Handbook on the Philosophy of Color. It's co-edited by myself and Fiona Macpherson. It's scheduled to come out in June this year, which is fast approaching. Fiona and I first conceived of this project way back during my first visit to Glasgow, which was in the fall of 2012. It is now 7.5 years later, and within a couple of months, the project will hit the shelves. It goes without saying, it took us a long time. We've been really happy with the support we've gotten from Routledge. We're happy with the shape of the volume. There's ways we could improve it, and there's some ideas that we had that we couldn't bring to fruition, but we're pleased enough with how everything's laid out. And we're especially pleased with the really stellar list of contributors that we were able to entice to write new chapters specifically for this volume. It's a representation of many of the leading philosophers of color in the world and some color theorists who maybe one wouldn't traditionally characterize as philosophers, like David Briggs. And they've all written very interesting, thought-provoking chapters for this volume. So you're encouraged to read it, if for no other reason than to be enticed by the works of some of these people. Two things else to remark about this slide. One is this image here. It's titled Rainbow. So there's some work being done now to actually inject. I won't flub on the details because I'm not an expert on it, but to inject chemicals into cells in their early stages of development so that the neural cells, as they develop, specific types will have specific colors. So what you see with this suite of colors is a literal image of neurons and the colors that they have, having been grown and developed with this kind of implementation in place. Those are not human neurons. I believe they're mouse neurons. But the reference for that is in the handbook, and we were really pleased to get permission to have it on the cover of the book. I also want to highlight while we're here, the illusions index. You should look that up. This is a web page of a number of illusions that we've collected together, mostly led by my colleague Fiona Macpherson over the last few years. There's images of these illusions, there's descriptions of their history, there's descriptions of what you should experience when you engage them, and a bit of a description about what's interesting or puzzling about them. I'll refer to some illusions in a few slides, but I wanted to highlight to you that this additional resource is available now online, and you should all bookmark it, or at least take a quick look. Okay, with regard to the Handbook of Color, I'll give you a quick map. The first section of the handbook we've titled The Importance of Color to Philosophy. And the basic idea was to try and reflect the fact that there are a number of different fields within philosophy that color has influenced. It's either been used as a stock example or been identified as a special kind of case to help illuminate some of the issues that persons in that field are engaging with. And we thought it would be good to have a section that doesn't cover all of the areas of philosophy that color has had an influence on, but at least some of them, to give readers a sense of how great that scope is. Unsurprisingly, a very important issue within philosophy where color has had an impact is philosophy of mind and the nature of the mind-body problem. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the thought experiment involving Mary the color scientist, who grows up in a black and white room and learns everything that she can about the science of color. And we ask, has she learned everything there is to know about color, having learned everything about the science of color, the optics, the neuroscience, and so on? And you might answer the question yes or no, and the story proceeds. Well, if she actually leaves her black and white room and experiences colors for the first time, it seems as though she's learned something new. Okay. That's one kind of case that philosophers have put forward to try and illustrate that color might have as something basic to teach about physical reality. Somewhat connected to the mind-body problem, there's questions about spectrum inversion, the swapping of colors between subjects, which I'll mention again later. And what you find in this chapter, written by Brian McLaughlin, is his take on ways in which issues in color impact and are impacted by basic questions about the relationship between the mind and the body. Skepticism and epistemology is a huge topic in philosophy going back millennia. And color is a persistent example found in the pre-Socratic times of a sort of phenomenon that it strikes us as being out there in the world, but on analysis may not actually be out there in the world, something I'll be talking about in a few minutes. And because of that kind of conundrum, leading some people to believe that perhaps we should have serious doubts about our knowledge of the external world, whether or not it's there or what it's like. So what you find in this chapter is a quick survey of those issues using color as a key example. Philosophy of science is a broad field, and here we have an article about ways in which some philosophers of science have used color as an example to illustrate the way they think of scientific theory building, debates about relationships between different sciences, debates about conceptual refinement and development and how those are applied to things in the world through the sciences, and a number of issues like that. Vagueness is a well-known problem in philosophy. Something like boundary conditions, or there being boundary cases between two different categories of things. So in classic cases, if you take a couple of grain of sands, you don't yet have a heap. This is the Sorites paradox. If you add an extra grain, you don't get yet a heap. If you add another grain and another grain, adding one grain is not going to get you a heap. But eventually, surely there will be enough grains for there to be a heap. And so it seems like there's no sharp point at which we've shifted from not having a heap of sand to having a heap of sand. In color, there's an obvious case of this sort. If you look at the boundaries between color categories, say the boundary between the reds and the oranges, you could look at a sample of red and say, oh yeah, that's red, and look at a sample of orange and say, oh yeah, that's orange. And you could start moving from the red towards the orange and keep asking yourself, is there a point at which I've crossed into the orange boundary? Or the sample of orange into the red, is there a point at which I've crossed the orange boundary? And intuitively, you might think the answer is no, there's no point. It's more of a gradual shift. So those sorts of gradual shifts and those sorts of phenomena whereby there's cases that appear to be at the boundary of two different categories, those are instances of what we call vagueness. Pretty intuitive and common sense, I think, for people that this phenomenon exists. And perhaps to your surprise, philosophers find it very perplexing and difficult to deal with. It should come as no shock that color is important to philosophy of art. It should come as maybe a little bit of a shock that most philosophers of color don't approach the subject through philosophy of art. And a number of philosophers of art that I've spoken to don't spend a lot of time trying to learn about the philosophy of color and theorizing about color. Color is just one of the things, one of the sets of properties that are in use in their theorizing and that are critical to understanding what art is and how art works. And so in this chapter, our author, John Kulvicki, gives a nice introduction to ways in which philosophy of art perhaps could and should inform philosophy of color. Because that dialogue to this point, I don't think is as strong as it could or should be. Fascinatingly, there are some interesting arguments about the analog or the analogy between color and value. So values would be norms, claims about what we should do, what's good or bad, easily appreciable by thinking about ethics and morality. Is that action a good action or not? Is that action a bad action or not? The sorts of questions that value theorists ask themselves and debate about regarding the nature of these values, the extent to which they're objective or subject dependent or group or culturally dependent, just generally how to understand them, have a lot of analogs in philosophy of color. And so there's been some discussion about whether or not the options that have been developed in philosophy of color can, by analogy, help illuminate the options that have been developed in the philosophy of value and vice versa. Okay. So what you get from this selection is not a comprehensive list by any means of the various ways in which philosophy has been impacted by color, but it's pretty clear, I hope, that there's a wide range of quite different issues where color is either a special case of interest or color is just a good example, one among maybe many that you could use to try and illuminate some of the questions that philosophers are interested in. We've got a selection on color phenomena. Again, this is an incomplete list, but very quickly, unique hues, something that I believe David is going to talk about a little bit. There are 4 unique hues on our standard understanding of human color vision right now. There's a unique blues and reds and greens and yellows. So unique hues are samples of colors that don't have any mixtures of other colors in them. So you can imagine a blue that has maybe some redness in it, and it gets a little bit purpley, or it has some green in it, and so it gets a little bit toward the aqua end. Well, if you make adjustments to the sample so that the color you see is a blue that doesn't have any hints of green, doesn't have any hints of red, doesn't have any hints of any other chromatic color, then you've isolated a unique blue. So this chapter is about the unique hues, blues, reds, greens, and yellows for humans, sketching them out and discussing some of the interesting philosophical issues that arise from trying to understand them. Novel colors, this chapter is written by my colleague Fiona Macpherson. I'm going to pick up speed a bit so that I don't go too long, although David said I could take a little bit more time than half an hour. But I will speed up a little bit. Novel colors are colors that maybe you haven't experienced before, or a group of normal human color perceivers haven't experienced before. So if you're thinking about normal human color perceivers, perhaps some of the color blind individuals, dichromats, perhaps they've experienced some colors that trichromats haven't experienced. So then those would be novel for the trichromats, or perhaps more persuasively, the trichromats have experienced some colors that the dichromats haven't. And so those colors would be novel for the dichromats. It may be the case that animals have different color experiences than us entirely, and then all those colors would be novel to us, and vice versa, and so on with aliens, and you could extend this in quite a number of different ways. I put reddish greens up there because this is one of the kinds of examples of novel colors that is discussed in the chapter. There's theoretical reasons to think that although we can experience reds and we can experience greens and we can experience reds and greens on top of each other and maybe one in front of the other, although they tend to blur together, having a color that is both reddish and greenish, or a color that you experience is both reddish and greenish, is in conflict with some basic theory in color. And there's some evidence to suggest that we can experience such colors. Okay. Color blindness is a really rich, interesting topic. The old model was very roughly that dichromats, people with 2 cones, or anomalous trichromats, people with 3 cones, but 2 of them are spaced together quite closely, that there's colors that they simply cannot experience that trichromats can. There's been a revisit to this basic picture and arguments made that in fact they can experience a number of the colors that they purportedly were unable to. Okay. Synesthesia is this roughly the phenomenon whereby you experience something in a modality that is either produced in a non-standard way within that modality, or produced by a different sensory modality. So intuitively, if you hear something and it causes you to visually see something as well, or you look at something and it causes you to hear something. Synesthetic experiences have been studied a lot in recent years. We've gotten a much, much better picture of them. And unsurprisingly, color is one of the standard cases. It's one of the most prevalent ones. And within that, probably the most prevalent is a kind of color grapheme synesthesia. So if you think of graphemes as symbols that have meaning for the subject, maybe letters or numbers, color grapheme synesthesia is where that particular symbol is experienced or is associated with the experience of a particular color. So perhaps the symbol is a letter, perhaps it's a word, it might be days of the week or months of the year, so that whenever you look at the word February, you also have an experience, say, of blue. Whether the bluishness that you experience is experienced to be on the word February, or floating in front of it, or somewhere in your mind's eye, is actually variable depending on the case. But the associations are there and they're pretty stable for these subjects. It's really interesting kind of phenomenon, especially the grapheme sort of case, because the color experience is being attached to a meaningful symbol, which means that it's not just a low-level perceptual phenomenon. It has to go through higher-level centers where meanings of stimuli are processed. Like a word like January or February is a pretty sophisticated, meaningful symbol. And so once the processing gets to there, somehow these color experiences are triggered. So this chapter gives a quick overview of the research that's been done there, the sorts of variations that are in play, and why it's of interest to us. Spectrum inversion is probably the question that I get asked most when someone finds out that I'm a philosopher of color. So does that mean that the blue that you experience is like the yellow that I experience, and vice versa? The blue that I experience is like the yellow that you experience. That's the phenomenon of spectrum inversion. It's a hypothesized phenomenon. It was first postulated to our knowledge by John Locke, great British philosopher. There are today a couple of empirical arguments in favor of it actually obtaining in a very small portion of the population, but of course not being detectable by us. So this chapter gives us an overview of some of these issues and why they've been so challenging for philosophers to incorporate into their theories of perception. It's only in the last few decades that we've really looked at what we sometimes call comparative color vision, or color vision in creatures other than humans. We've learned a ton, but there's lots more to go. There's good reasons to think that different creatures can perceive colors because they can make discriminations consistently between what are different colored things at an intuitive level. Right? So they might be able to re-identify something that's a different object but has the same color features. So we'll be able to pick that out, or distinguish two things or three things that are the same except for their color features. Right? So you can get some behavioral evidence for them having color experiences. You can dig into their eyes, look at the cones, and there's evidence of those cones being there and of having absorption profiles that are consistent with them having color visual systems. So we've got pretty good reason to think that they have color visual systems, and insofar as they have visual experiences at all, they would then probably have color visual experiences. We also have reason to have, by studying those things I mentioned, we also have reason to believe that the spaces of colors that they engage with don't map nicely onto the spaces of colors that humans engage with. And so that generates a challenging kind of scenario for color theorists. Color constancy is the chapter that I wrote for the volume. Very roughly, it's the phenomenon whereby the colors of things are experienced to be fairly stable across changes in parameters like conditions of illumination. It's a really complicated area in color science, and philosophers have been interested in it for a number of reasons. And I'll say no more than that, because you're all going to go read that chapter. I'm going to talk about a couple of color illusions in a second. And so this chapter in the volume tries to outline what some of them are and how philosophers might deal with them. Okay. Moving much more quickly, with regard to color ontology, there's, if you like, four basic dimensions in the debates about color ontology, or what colors are in our world. There's the objective-subjective, which you can think of as the extent to which colors are independent of minds versus the extent to which colors are entirely dependent on minds. There's the reductive versus primitive or non-reductive. So this is the extent to which colors are reducible to basic low-level physical facts, or maybe they're not quite reducible to that, maybe to what we sometimes call functional facts, which we don't think of as basic low-level facts, or maybe they're not even reducible to functional facts, maybe they're just their own even higher level set of properties. Relational versus monadic, I will talk about in a minute. It's the extent to which colors are intrinsic properties of things or defined by reference to other things, relational. And pluralism versus uniqueness is intuitively just the idea that for the uniqueness theorist, a given uniform surface, say this highlighter, has a unique color. Maybe it's fluorescent yellow. And the pluralist will deny that and look at a uniform surface and say, yes, maybe it does have fluorescent yellow or green, but it might also have, indeed does have, some other colors too. That's the pluralist idea. Okay. So if you're going to give an account of what colors are, what their nature is, and where we can find them in this world, these are some of the dimensions that you'll have to think about and take a stand on to give a robust account. And if you think about it, they can kind of play off each other. Some bits can solve some of the problems that arise when you think about color, and some other bits might solve some other problems. So you can kind of whittle your way through the issues to come up with a coherent theory. My focus is going to be on the objective-subjective dimension. With regard to color experience, there's three huge categories of theories of perception, huge in the sense of three dominant categories of perceptual theories in philosophy right now: representationalism and naive realism and sense-datum theory. And it's fair to say that representationalism is the dominant view in most of the English-speaking world. Sense-datum theory was the dominant view for much of the first 2/3 of the 20th century, and then kind of fell out of favor. And naive realism is a view that has some currency in the UK right now, and a couple of pockets elsewhere. So in this section, these people, there's 3 chapters, one for each of these theories, and trying to explain how color can inform and be informed by each of those theories. And they're going to be asking questions like, what do good perceptions consist of? What do bad conceptions consist of? How are the good and bad perceptions related? Color language, categories, and thought. One way to study color is through looking at the words we use to describe it, the objects we apply it to, and the other words that those color words connect to. There's a beautiful history to this, and some nice theory that's developed out of it. Colors look particular ways to us, and some of those looks might change in different circumstances or across different people. And the categories I mentioned before, so the blue category is the collection of the blues, and the red category is the collection of the reds, and same with the greens. So we've got chapters on all of these things and the cognitive penetration of color perception. Ways in which our beliefs about color might impact the colors that we actually visually see, visually experience. We wanted to have a chapter on color agnosia, which is a surprising phenomenon whereby through some neural damage, subjects appear to have some basic color vision intact. They can make some color discriminations, but they're unable to describe the colors that they experience. So it's as though there's a cut between their color vision and their color visual experience and their language systems, their ability to talk about and describe them. In the end, we weren't able to secure a chapter on this, but it's a really interesting phenomenon that philosophers care about and that we should be looking at in the future. Before I move on, the other section of the handbook that I haven't mentioned is the one right after the initial section on color and philosophy more generally, and before the one on color ontology or color phenomena. And in between there, we have an interlude. And the point of the interlude was the first section introduces you to ways in which color has influenced philosophy across the whole discipline. And then the other sections that I just went through quickly detail some more specific focused questions, and we get detailed chapters on that. We thought it would be good in between those two to introduce readers to the science of color and the science of the spaces of color. And so we secured 2 chapters, one on a quick overview of the science of color, which is a really, really huge field. And we're grateful to our authors, Alex Byrne and David Hilbert, for having written a beautiful 20-page summary of what's happening in color science, and a chapter on the spaces of color, color spaces, which is a really interesting technical topic that David Briggs happens to be one of the foremost experts on. That's our handbook. It's going to be out soon, and I hope you're as excited about it as I am. After 7+ years, I can't wait. Okay, on to the rest of the talk. I'll move a bit more quickly, but I want to give you a sense of what objective colors are, why we might not want to go that way, and what the remaining subjective options might be, and which of those we might wish to endorse. So this is just to do some philosophy particularly pertaining to color ontology, or what colors are and what their natures are. Color objectivism basically says that colors are out there in the environment, independent of us. Carrots are orange, their tops are green. Post boxes are red. Why would you hold this view? Well, you might argue from language and thought. We talk about and think about carrots as being orange. We talk about and think about post boxes as being red. Perception. We see orange on or in carrots. We see red on or in post boxes. So those are good intuitive reasons to believe that colors are objective. In slightly more detail, what does it mean to say that they're objective? What properties should we say these colors are? I'll give you some options. Color vision is tied to ways things interact with light. And so perhaps colors are the spectral surface reflectance profiles or light reflectance profiles of surfaces. Perhaps colors are wavelengths of light. Perhaps they are light transmission properties, so the way that a medium transmits light. Some combination of any of those. Or maybe you're not happy with, in the end, any of those basic physical properties for identifying colors, and you think that there's something that is somewhat different from that, just a set of properties that are in and of themselves colors. That'd be more of a primitivist view of color. So these are some of the ways that you might characterize or develop the idea that colors are objective. Here's why a number of people, very briefly, don't endorse that view. Now, I should say, within philosophy of color, and within philosophy more broadly, the idea of objective colors has a fair bit of currency. But if you look in color science, in psychology of color, there's a lot more skepticism about that. And so part of my point in what follows is to reflect some of that skepticism, but also part of the point is to push hard on the people who are a bit skeptical about the objectivity of color to come up with the goods to give us something better. Okay. So why should we not accept the idea that colors are objective? You might want to look at illusions. Here's a very penetrating color illusion. If, like me, you experience blue discs on both the left and the right images, it's kind of a floating, transparent, light blue disc in both sides, then you're experiencing the illusion. Insofar as there is anything objectively blue in each of these images, on the one on the right, the blue squiggly lines, those are blue. All the blue squiggly lines are blue. But the rest of the image, in and of itself, insofar as it has color, only has black and white. Similarly, on the left-hand side, the light blue semicircular rings on all four of these, those have features that you might identify with blue, and the rest of this image only has black and white. So insofar as you experience a blue disc filled in with transparent light blue throughout, the absolute majority of that, some 90% or more, isn't out there in the world. At least so the illusion says. This is a similar kind of illusion if, like me, you experience kind of a faint light yellow tinge inside of this image, especially compared to in here, it's not there, this is much whiter, and outside the image is much whiter, but inside is kind of a yellow filter. The only parts of this image that have anything that you could identify with yellow, objectively speaking, the argument goes, is the yellow squiggly line inside. The yellow squiggly lines inside here. So somehow, with the yellow squiggly lines on the inside of this shape, your vision system takes that and fills in faint yellow throughout the rest of the image. Okay. Hallucinations. I can't actually get you to hallucinate colors. I don't have that power. And even if I did, I don't think ethically I could use it. But we can induce in you after-image effects. I'm not going to do it because it takes a couple of minutes and I'm mindful of the time, but you can push play on this video. This video is a really simple illustration of how after-images can be created. We owe it to Qasim Zaidi, who produced it for illustration. I got it from his webpage. And they're quite powerful. Okay, so what those kinds of cases suggest to some people is that your vision system does have the power to create some color experiences that don't seem to map onto objective reality. So it can create those. It's a powerful, if true, it's a powerful tool or constructive capacity that your minds have, and it might make you worry about whether or not colors are actually out there. This feeds into a larger phenomenon of color variation. So to try and categorize it a little bit, color variation is ways that colors vary, the experience colors of things vary as conditions vary. So you can have intrasubjective, so color variation within a subject at a given time, intersubjective, so that's across individuals within a species, and intersubjective too across species. This is an example of intrasubjective, so within a subject at a time. If, like me, you look at this image, you've probably seen it before. The top half looks to be kind of a dark gray with light coming down on it, and the bottom half looks to be a white, albeit in shadow. Insofar as there are color properties on the top half and the light and the bottom half of this image, they are the same. So the kind of reflectance profiles or light emission profiles coming from here and reflectance profiles or light emission profiles coming from here are the same, but you experience them to be differently colored. So this would be an example of the same sample or the same something that's physically the same, looking to have different colors in different contexts. Okay. So these kinds of cases, there are many of them, motivate the argument from color variation. It's a very, very old argument, goes back to ancient philosophy, and it's been refined in a number of ways since then. I'll give you a quick and dirty version, just to give you a feel for how the reasoning works. Color variation is a fact, says premise one. The experienced color of some entity varies along dimensions, some of which are environmental, some of which belong to the subject, that are extrinsic to that thing. So if the thing is a marker, extrinsic dimensions might be conditions of illumination or the medium through which light's traveling. And then, of course, the subjective dimensions might be the kinds of cones I have in my eyes and things like that. Two, no privilege. There's no reason to treat one experienced color of X as most accurate of X. So there may be some that you want to exclude because they're weird, but even if you exclude some because they're weird, there's no reason to treat one of these experienced colors of X as most accurate, given the kind of variation that we have. And so we should treat several of these as the same vis-a-vis accuracy. The best explanation of this entails that colors are not objective. You can think through the reasoning about what different options there might be on the table, but I'll just put it to you that this is a very powerful argument that has convinced a number of smart people and not convinced some other very smart people um, to reject the idea that colors are objective. Another reason comes from color properties. First thing you should do is ask David Briggs. Second thing you should do is come back to the slides, and here's a quick and dirty statement of what they are and why they've been used to motivate the rejection of objective color. For our purposes, color properties are this. Basic color dimensions like hue and saturation and lightness. So hue is maybe going around the circle from blues to reds to greens, blues to purples to reds, and so on. Saturation is the richness of a color. So a really vivid, rich colors would be on the outside, and it gets desaturated as you move in. And lightness is the degree to which it's toward the white end of the spectrum versus darker toward the black end of the spectrum. There's a lot of relations between colors. Composition, which is adding colors together, say to get other colors. Exclusions, putting in one kind of color might block another. Similarity relations, blues are maybe more similar to purples than they are to reds. And there's the categories which I've mentioned as well. So although color properties are quite sophisticated, as David will tell you, here's an argument, or at least get the logical reasoning that motivates the idea that because of this color, because of these features, colors are not objective. Premise one, color structure is a fact. We experience colors to have a bunch of internal features, like the ones I mentioned. There is no credible explanation of color structure by reference only to the objective world. So objective features like lights, surfaces, media transmission. Colors have color structure. So color structure isn't merely how colors seem to us. Right? Color structure is a representation of features of colors themselves. So if you take away hues and lightnesses and similarities and categories of colors, it's not as though you're then left with colors, says premise 3. You've just given up on colors entirely. And so putting these things together, colors can't be objective properties. The structure is there, it's part of what colors are, and we can't explain it by reference to objective reality alone. Are there advocates of the idea that colors are not objective, setting aside whether or not they endorsed those particular kinds of arguments? Sure there are. You'll know some of them. Here's Galileo. I think that tastes, odors, colors, and so on are no more than mere names as far as the object in which we locate them are concerned. If living creatures were removed, all of these qualities would be wiped away and annihilated. Newton quite famously developed a wavelength theory of color. And you might think that that meant for Newton, colors are wavelength properties of light. But when push came to shove, Newton said this: the rays of light, so to speak, are not colored. In them, there is nothing else than a certain power and disposition to stir up a sensation of this or that color. As an academic now living and working in Scotland, I would be remiss if I didn't mention David Hume. For him, the mind has a great propensity to spread itself on external objects, gilding and staining all natural objects with the colors. Those are some examples from the early modern period. There are many examples before and after that we could give. If we go back to the pre-Socratic times, hundreds and hundreds of years earlier, by convention, there are sweet and bitter, hot and cold. By convention, there is color. But in truth, there are atoms in the void. A very, very old statement, and I'm sure there are a number of people around today who would consent or endorse something pretty close to that. So part of the point I want to make is, if you're convinced by the sorts of arguments that I've given against the objectivity of color, there's a burden on you. It's not enough merely to deny objective color. Without a positive account of what colors are and what is happening in color perception, one doesn't even have a theory of color. And so there is no victory here yet. These conclusions, these assertions that these wonderfully insightful thinkers made is just the first step in the project of rejecting the objectivity of color. If you want to go that route, you have to do more than this and come up with something more positive. So I'll give you some options for what those positive things might be, and I'll try and convince you that they're okay, but they're not great. And so there's much more work to be done. One option is color relationalism. There's a number of different ways to develop this view. Here's one. Colors are, the basic idea is that colors are relations between a perceiver and elements of her environment. And on the one I'm going to give you, so these elements can include illumination conditions, light reflectances, light transmission properties, and so on. So it's a relationship between surfaces and lighting conditions and light transmission conditions, but also perceiver conditions. So conditions of the perceiver's early visual states, maybe mid visual states, maybe late, more complicated visual states. So blue isn't a simple property at all. Insofar as something's blue, it's relativized to all of these parameters. So it might be blue for me, given this light, this transmission properties, and given my visual state being like this, having just seen this other thing before, and maybe having remembered this other thing from earlier, and all these factors coming into play are what make the particular event that's happening one in which I see blue. And that is what's going to give you what blue is in the world. It's a rather complicated take. Mentalism. It's a bit simpler. Doesn't mean it's better. Colors are in us. They're not in the world around us. Colors are properties of perceivers' mental states. Maybe you want to identify them with sensations, maybe experiences, maybe brain states or neural states, something like that. But colors are literally in the mind. Eliminativism. Nothing in our world has colors. Not carrots, not sensations, not relations between carrots and sensations, nothing. This image is supposed to be an image of a colorless world, but of course, you can see some white and some gray and some black in this image, and whites and grays and blacks, we think of them as colors. They're achromatic colors, as opposed to the chromatic blues and greens, but they're colors nonetheless. And so this image doesn't represent what a colorless world would be like. It represents what an achromatic world would be like. For a colorless world, you'd have to take away all the whites and grays and blacks as well. I'm not sure that you would be left with vision, but nonetheless, that's the eliminativist view. Colors are like ether or dragons, theoretical postulates that aren't in our world. Well, which of these should we endorse? If you're convinced by the kind of arguments I gave earlier for the conclusion that colors aren't objective, then you got to put forward something, or at least try to put forward something for what colors are. And those options, relationalism, mentalism, eliminativism, are the three big categories, I would argue, that we've got from philosophy of color to this point. Are they any good? Is blue really blue for me in this light, given that my eyes are in this particular state, having been exposed to some other thing a moment ago, that my visual cortex is in this particular state? Is this a good way to characterize what colors are? Isn't this circular? Aren't you defining blue in terms of blue for me? I think we should be cautious. It's a little bit dangerous. It's also a little bit dangerous to be a mentalist. Our brains don't look to have colors. Colors don't look like they're in our heads in any way. If they're in there, then somehow we're experiencing the insides of our brains. And the eliminativist view isn't any more compelling. You open up your eyes every morning, and there sure seem to be colors. There sure seem to be colors out there on things in the world. So what is going on when we see these colors all day long? None of these are particularly attractive, I think, if you reflect on them for a moment. All of them reject the claim that colors are objective. So what should we conclude? Yes, there are reasons to believe that colors are subjective or mind-dependent. This alone isn't telling us much about what colors are and about how we perceive them. So we have to do more than that. All of the known options for filling in the story are odd, but at least they're theories or options that can be developed and questioned. I'm not trying to push you into one of them or the other. I'm trying to push you into accepting these basic claims. Yes, there's reasons to reject the objectivity of color. That alone isn't the end of the story. It's on us to do more to fill out the rest of the picture, and it turns out it's not easy to do that. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to be here. Feel free to send me questions over email, derek.brown.2@glasgow.ac.uk. I'll make sure that the organizers of the session make that available to people if they like. If you want to visit us at some point in the Illusion Index, do that. If you want to take a look at the Routledge Handbook when it comes out, please do that. If you really want to visit us at the Center for the Study of Perceptual Experience, by all means, drop us a note. We welcome visitors regularly. We're delighted to have you. Thank you so much, and I hope to speak with you or talk to you at some point.